Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
SoundCartel.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. The federal budget came as a surprise to many of us with the announcement of a surplus. Some are saying the first such surplus in 15 years. But plenty of governments have announced budget surpluses over that period. It's just that they've never actually delivered one. Our regular economics commentator from the University of Melbourne, Professor Neville Norman, says we should be wary of smoke and mirrors, though the budget does display something of a steady hand. He calls the budget mildly inflationary and explains his reasoning to Jeff Waters.
And let's correct a couple of things. This amazing surplus that took many people by surprise, we've got to remember that a budget is like a profit and loss statement. It's the biggest one in the country, and it indeed covers the expenditures of the government and the revenue of the government, and any difference is a surplus or deficit. And the expenditures are about a quarter of all the expenditures in the whole community. And of course, it's a forward look like any budget. Now, I was surprised that the normally well-researched Have You Been Paying Attention program, which I love on television, asked as its first question for the year, more or less, which or what has been announced for the first time in 15 years in a budget. And the answer was given, of course, a budget surplus. Wrong. First of all, I know it hasn't been delivered, and there it is, but in fact, 7 times, including this one in those 15 years, has a budget surplus been announced, twice by Treasurer Swan for the ALP, and then Treasurers Hockey, Morrison and Freudenberg, 4 other times, have announced it. I think unluckily, COVID interrupted all of this for Freudenberg, or we would certainly have had it for the 2020 budget. So the reality is none of them has delivered a surplus. This one might, good chance that it will, maybe it won't, but the point is that 7 of them since the Costello one that was actually delivered 15 years ago have been announced. Now, in terms of the rest of those claims, I've independently looked at the impact on real economic activity and on inflation, and my assessment, using independent modelling of the ingredients of the budget and the circumstances of what's already going on, is that there is a mild expansionary effect of the budget due to the fact that there's a bigger distribution of the gains towards low-income people who spend a higher percentage of their income than those who pay for it through the tax area, and as a result, it's also likely to be mildly inflationary, as the opposition have said, and the government says no. So there is a small inflationary risk. But going back to the economic activity effect of the budget, with the big spending and big taxes, it's likely that we will not see a recession, as I've said for a long time, but for those who are looking at economic activity per head of population, per capita, to use the right Latin, it's likely we will get at least one negative quarters and maybe a recession in that sense. But in terms of overall economic growth, particularly as we're a country now with very substantial population growth, not least the migration bounce back, very, very unlikely. So the answer to all of those claims is it's not the first surplus delivered. It might be. We don't know that yet for a few weeks. Remember that the surplus claim was for the year that's about to finish, not the one that's coming up.
Given what you said before, and given that some of those treasurers had bad luck, what are the chances that this surplus will actually be delivered?
Oh, quite substantial, I think, given that, let's go to the next issue of why are we in this position? Well, there's 3 things that are really not much to do with this government that have come to its assistance. The first is the considerable growth in company profits and thus company tax revenue arising from mineral resources and energy prices that are very, very strong. The second is almost as important as this, the automatic effect of the personal income tax system by governments and treasurers leaving the brackets and the rates, the marginal tax rates of the personal income tax scale unchanged as we slide up it. And this has an increasing proportion of tax coming from personal income tax and going to coffers without announcing a tax increase. The third thing is a little bit of a game being played to shunt some expenditure into the next financial year in order to make this happen. I think it's one of the reasons that the deficits return again in what I call the FIFO. Now, not the accounting concept, but the mining industry idea of fly in, fly out. So these surpluses fly in and fly out as soon as possible, largely because they're trading on these windfalls that have come, and there is, I suppose, some restraint in not going too hard on spending, and nor is there need to do, because I can't remember a time where the politics are as strongly in favour of the current government, not forgetting that they still have to be careful in the Senate where they've got to appease the Greens and the Independents, while the opposition parties, the coalition, are tearing itself apart. So this is the political background as well as the economic background. So in summary, yes, possibly a surplus. So more or less a balanced budget. If it's $4 billion, this is a drop in the ocean compared with the big budget aggregates of $700 to $800 billion from that. Mildly expansionary and mildly inflationary, and that leads on to issues about what happens next.
Yes, well, let's look at that and the pressure that has been on the RBA and the government. I mean, this government certainly didn't expect when it first came in the inflation rates that it has had to confront. Last year, you said most of the rate rises will have happened by now. Is that still your assessment?
I think it is. I won't rule out another one because the robotic reaction of the Reserve Bank responding to measured CPI increases is that we might see yet another, but it's very likely that we've seen them all. We've only had small rate rises this year, and we had the pause that threw people off. That, I think, adds to the list of concerns about the damage done by statements and non-statements from what should have been a more responsible public policy body. And I think we're just about there. Also note that inflation is falling quite a bit in the United States. Prices are not, but inflation is. And I think this is heading towards a situation in which we've had most of the rate rises. The reasons the bank gives of curbing inflation, I think, are ill-researched and untenable. However, rates need to be about where they are. We're talking not the high threes for the Reserve Bank cash rate. We're talking 7 or 8% that people actually pay. Rates need to be there in order for money to be appreciated and lenders to be rewarded. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. But the opposition is right that this budget does test whether the bank will go again. I stand by what I predicted at the end of last year. Most of the rate rises will have happened from May 2022 and occurred before now.
And you're confident that the budget assessment over the forward estimates is correct and that inflation will soften?
Yes, I think inflation will soften, not because of what the bank's done, but simply because the natural disasters of fire and flood, the worldwide impetus from the energy prices, and some independent indirect tax changes that we've seen, none of which have got anything to do with domestic demand pressure that the Reserve Bank can influence through interest rates, they are abating. And to repeat, prices are seldom falling. It's inflation rates that are falling, and that's what the bank is responding to.
Yes, and that's change over time. Now, turning to specific parts of our economy and those most directly involved with our listeners, are there positives and negatives that have been changed by this budget?
Well, yes, there are. Leaving aside some specific support through the handouts that have gone to people in need and the NDIS and so on, there are some winners from this. Anyone to do with the hydrogen sector, electrification, Teaching and training, there's support there. Home building, there's supports. Migration facilitation, and students, of course. But there's some losers, the large superannuants with the big funds over $3 million, and Commonwealth Games funding and the Tullamarine rail link, both under question or not provided for. But you can win from this budget if you're sick but not too sick and seeking bulk billing, and you don't smoke or vape or do any of the things that they're increasing their taxes for. You'll be a winner.
You've seen a few budgets now. What grade would you give this one?
Well, Jeff, I'm a hard marker and I've seen many budgets. I'd give this 7.5 out of 10. I have given 9 to Costello and Keating and 1 or 2 others, but I've given the 3s and 4s without mentioning a former Prime Minister who was a treasurer in recent times. And I think it's pretty good for a political science graduate to have done the way that he's done. But after all, his doctorate was on Keating, so he should be good.
That was University of Melbourne Economics Professor Neville Norman. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.